a lovely crowd. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Amali, and I'm the events director here at Books Are Magic. We are so excited to have Colson Whitehead with us tonight to celebrate the launch, or the paperback launch, of Crook Manifesto. But before we get officially started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's event is going to go. First up, we will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the talk, so please start thinking of questions to ask and hold on to them. After the talk tonight, Colson will be around to sign and personalize your books at the alcove next to where you checked in. We'll let you know where and when to start lining up for that. And lastly, if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we would love to encourage you to buy a copy of Crook Manifesto online using the link in the live stream description. Okay, now as we get settled into tonight's space, into New York of the 1970s, ripe with energy, verve, and vice, conmen and crooks, and much more, it's my pleasure to introduce National Book Award winner, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and #1 New York Times bestselling author of 12 works of fiction and nonfiction, and first ever Books Are Magic customer.
How do you do? Thanks so much for coming out. It's so nice to be reading in New York, reading at Books Are Magic. Since the Underground Railroad, I've been doing a lot of traveling, all different kinds of places. Europe, Asia, other foreign lands, Florida, and some places were fun. Other places I don't have to go back to anytime soon. I remember one time I was going to land in Eastern Europe, in an unnamed country. I don't want to say the name. And I was like, oh, let's see what's happening in this country, check out the news. And the first story that came up was the biggest neo-Nazi march in years happened on Strasse last week. If I want to see neo-Nazis marching down the street, I just go to Virginia or Charlottesville. I don't have to fly across the ocean. But wherever I go, there's one question I always get asked, and it's, where do you get your ideas? And I get my ideas from all kinds of places, depending on the book. Sometimes it's unexpected, sometimes it's an article. With The Intuitionist, my first book, I got the idea from a dream. I got the idea from a TV show. I was watching Dateline NBC, and they had a piece about the hidden dangers of escalators. And they interviewed an escalator inspector, and apparently if you have tiny feet or you're a child, you can lose a toe when the tread detaches from the side. And I thought, that's a weird job. I love escalator inspector. Somebody has to do it. And then from growing up in New York City, I thought escalator inspector, elevator inspector. It's not the rule now, but for many years, each elevator had to have the inspection certificate, and the guy signs his name, and you go to school, you go to work, and he's been there. It's the same handwriting. Maybe it's blue ink or it's black ink year after year. You go to your friend's house, and you see their elevator, and the same guy's been there. Sort of like cops with precincts. And so I thought, what if an elevator inspector had to solve a criminal case? That'd be interesting. I could use a detective novel plot. People seem to like plot. And a good idea for a novel. And so I went to the library, actually the Brooklyn Business Library, which is on Cabin Plaza, I'm not sure if it's still there, to see what kind of skills an elevator inspector would bring to a criminal case. And the answer was none, because they're elevator inspectors. So the book changed and became all about elevators, and this world where elevator inspectors are really important. So I got the idea just from watching Dateline NBC in '96. I got the idea for Zone 1 from a dream, like I was saying before. I had very permissive parents, and probably saw a lot of movies that I should not have seen. I was probably too young to see them. It was the 70s, and I was a free-range kid. In the 70s, parents were more sort of ornamental. The word parent was really just sort of an honorific if you procreated. And we watched a lot of TV together. We got cable as soon as it was invented, so we didn't have to talk to each other. And on Saturday nights, we would watch movies together, my parents, my brother, and me. And that's when I saw my first Stanley Kubrick, A Clockwork Orange. I was like 9 or 10. And I remember asking my mother, you know, what's happening to that woman up there? And she said, shh, it's a comment on society. So that was my first introduction to him. I saw Night of the Living Dead at a very early young age. I was like 10, and PBS was showing it on Halloween. And I think even then, you know, zombies sort of resonated with me. If you've never seen the movie, basically there's a black protagonist, and I didn't see that a lot growing up. And the black protagonist is being chased by a white mob that wants to tear him limb from limb. And I think that seemed like a metaphor for America even back then. And I saw Dawn of the Dead, the sequel, which was actually rated X for excessive gore a couple years later. And from then, I had zombie dreams for decades, like once a month at least, for year after year. Sometimes they were fast, you know, sometimes they were slow, sometimes they talked, sometimes they'd catch me, sometimes I'd escape. And depending on my sort of emotional weather, I would have these zombie dreams. And that went on for a really long time until 2009. And I was going through some changes in my life. My father just passed away. I was about to get divorced. There were some hints I was about to get divorced, such as getting a divorce lawyer. That sort of tipped me off. But in the summer, we often had, you know, guests out to Sag Harbor. My father built this house, my aunt owned it, and we could like rent it for a month. And I should have done it that year because I was in flux. But we had people out. It's a house my grandfather built in the 40s. The walls are very thin. It's like a no sex house. I try to make clear to everybody who comes. It's July 4th. We have a barbecue, fireworks, please no sex, everyone can hear it. And so that meant when I woke up Saturday morning that I heard my guests sort of laughing and having fun downstairs, making breakfast. And I was like, I shouldn't have done it. Yeah, there's too much stuff going on. So I willed myself back to sleep, which is a skill I sort of developed over the years. I had a dream. And in the dream, I didn't know if I could go out into the living room because I wasn't sure if they had swept the zombies out yet. And so I woke up and I thought, oh, that's actually a really good consideration. That's a real consideration. After the apocalypse, who's going to get rid of the extra zombies? Like, we're in apartments, we're in the subway, and someone has to clean all that stuff up. I was like, oh, that's maybe a book there. If you're a writer or, you know, or anybody, you know, sometimes you get an idea in the middle of the night and you write, you know, the idea down in the darkness, and you wake up in the morning and there's something like, kill my dad, make love to my mother, or something. And it's like, that's not a novel. It's like a short story, and it's been done before in antiquity. But I got an idea for a book from a dream, and I was very happy. In terms of Harlem Shuffle and Crook Manifesto, I got the idea from trying to figure out what movie to rent. I was with my wife. My wife was driving. I didn't have a license at that point. And I thought Ocean's 11, like again, I just kept renting Ocean's 11. I think it's a great movie, and I was really envious of Steven Soderbergh because he must have had so much fun coming up with these capers. And so I was like, could I maybe write a heist novel? And so I gave myself permission. And I had to come up with a hero, a protagonist. And there's one character in heist movies I always hate, and it's the fence. The criminals, or the heisters, who we've seen watched through most of the movie, have pulled off the heist, they've been shot, they're on run from police, and then they go to the fence, and the fence is like, I'll give you 10 cents on the dollar. I always hate that guy. But what if I was my protagonist? So I did some research into what fences do, and it turns out a lot of them deal in stolen goods, but they'll have a legit storefront. And so they'll sell furniture or electronics in the front of the store, and in the back of the store, they'll sell the stolen merchandise. And to me, that spoke to a divided nature. Maybe you have one face to the world and another secret face that you keep hidden. And so that became the sort of psychological blueprint for Ray Carney. He wants to be an upstanding citizen. He has a storefront on 125th Street in Harlem. But his model for manhood was his father, who was a crook. And so even though he wants to be on the straight and narrow, there's a voice in the back of his head that's always going, let's do some crimes. So I had a protagonist, I had a genre. I have been doing a lot of historical fiction the last couple of years. A lot of my earlier novels very contemporary. When I reached a point, I think with Zone 1, where I thought I didn't have much to say about contemporary life. Just kind of like a really angry 29-year-old who's probably more in tune with how things are screwed up. And so I started writing about stories that took place in the past, and it's been a very good sort of source of inspiration. So I knew that the heist novel would not take place now. I didn't want it to take place before World War II because I was really worn out from doing research, and just didn't want to do all that work anymore. And so I had to pick a year, and I thought, maybe the blackout of '77, that could be a good opportunity for my heisters. The cops are distracted, they can pull off a heist, but that seemed like too obvious. I thought maybe one of our race riots. There was a race riot in the early '40s when a young woman was beaten by cops, and there were protests. But Ralph Ellison used that same riot for Invisible Man, and so it seemed like dibs. He called it but there was one in 1964, and I thought that'd be a good opportunity. My heisters would use the civil unrest to cover their crimes, but I didn't want to exploit it, and so it actually takes place the week after the riot. And I kept coming up with more capers and stories for Ray Carney, and so that book became 3 stories. And I would follow him over 5 years, and in 59, 61, and 64. And that seemed like a cool idea. And halfway through, I was coming up with even more capers, so that was like 2 books, 6 different stories. But if you do 2 books, like what's a twofer? It's used to be a trilogy, so it became a trilogy very organically. And it's been a great project. I'm following this character in his 30s, and then in his 40s, and his 50s, and the final volume I'm working on now. But also the city over that time, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I've always hated it when critics or reviewers are like, the city is almost a character. Like Dublin in Ulysses by James Joyce is almost a character. It's like, wow, you're really pushing the frontiers of literary criticism. I don't want to go on a limb too much. But I was halfway through Harlem Shuffle and I was like, fuck. The city is almost a character. So I just had to go with it. And then each decade, of course, is a different stage for Ray Carney. In 1964, when we see him, the World's Fair is going on in Queens, but if you go 2.5 miles to the northeast into Harlem, the neighborhood is starting to decline, and we see that great contrast. In the 70s, of course, New York was broke. The fiscal crisis is in full swing, and that's another sort of stage for Carney as a person and a parent, but also as a criminal. And then in the 80s, the ship has righted itself, and Wall Street's roaring again, development is happening, but also, if you look towards the end of the 80s, we see the height of the AIDS crisis and the coming of the crack epidemic. And so Ray is having these different ups and downs in his life, and then so is the city. And so it's just been really really cool to think about the city in that way. I started writing Crook Manifesto 6 months into the pandemic, and you could go into Times Square and only be the only person in Times Square. It was a very different city, and there were all these people in the paper like, New York will never come back. New York always comes back, so I had complete faith in that. And And I was writing about a time that was very desperate, the 1970s. But if you look back out of that time, we got hip hop and punk and disco, and so even though times were very desperate, the city had this creative force that was rejuvenating it, and I felt connected to that when I was writing Crook Manifesto, and so it was this nice sort of overlap between the two things. To be here, you had to either buy the book or a gift certificate. So I thought I'd read from the third book that I'm working on now, the 80s book. If you don't like the 80s book, maybe you'll still buy a Crook Manifesto. Like he went downhill after a Crook Manifesto. But if you haven't read it, you have no idea. So you might just buy it anyway. So I'm going to read, if I can, just read two short sections from book 3, 1980s. Like the first two books, it takes place in 3 years. In this case, 81, 83, and then an unnamed year. In the first section, it's 81, and New York has come out of the fiscal crisis. It's the time of Edward Koch. He used to say, like, how am I doing? And so that's there. Ray Carney's still in the book. He did not die in Crook Manifesto, which is a spoiler alert. He's up to his old shenanigans. So here's a section from it. In all of Ray Carney's years as a fence, he'd been a reluctant fence and a ruthless fence, at times harried and imperiled by his choices, and at other times the embodiment of crooked intelligence. There was only one occasion when he participated in the theft itself, and that was in the summer of 1981, when Uncle Rich came back to town. That bad news time. The city that year was true to its personality, as malformed across the centuries. A monstrous entity powered by innate miseries, operated by brute will, and held together by pluck, fury, and rebar. It had been flat broke, and now clambered determinedly from the crater of debt, one mucky handhold at a time. Crime, in its ingenuity, devised new permutations daily, making every citizen a victim or a witness. New arrivals poured in hourly, as if there was room, multiplying the local varieties of sadness and perseverance, and outnumbering those who'd scurried to the suburbs or fled their last humiliation. It was dirty and sick and plain spoken in its threats. How am I doing? The mayor asked on his rounds, barking like one of the mangy seals installed at the decrepit and neglected Central Park Zoo, a real dump. It was his trademark. Everybody needs a gimmick. How am I doing? The same as everybody else, tired, banged up, but staggering forth somehow. As for Ray Carney, he was a son of his city, enduring his ration of misfortunes and managing to engineer a few reversals. The day the Uncle Rich mess came to a head, Tuesday, the 16th of June, was already out of the ordinary in that Carney had a notable appointment. An interview with Sterling Quality, the monthly magazine of the Sterling Furniture Company. Carney had sold their products since he first opened his doors to budget-conscious Harlemites of contemporary sensibility and taste, to bright-eyed couples who strained cheerfully under the monthly payments, to geezers who set themselves adrift in living rooms on new recliners. Now the company had chosen him as Northeastern Regional Dealer of the Month, August. Carney jumped up and almost knocked over his coffee when he got the call. Across a lifetime, a man cultivates a number of secret wishes that he dare not share with the world. Precious things, too delicate to exist outside the safe pastures of his mind. To see his name flow and curl in a dignified typeface of the Sterling Furniture House magazine? It was a dream he'd held close for decades. He and Elizabeth celebrate with a dinner at this French joint off Lexington, where two tiny portions coiled on the big plates in insolent triumph. So, Ray Carney's back, and also Pepper. I didn't know that Pepper would be such a big character when I started in Harlem Shuffle. Heist movies were a big inspiration. Famous ones like Ocean's 11, and also gritty 70s crime movies like The Taking of Pelham 123, The Outfit, Charlie Varick, and then a few books. And the biggest inspiration was Richard Stark's character, Parker, Richard Stark novels. And so Pepper started off as a tribute to the sort of sociopathic, expert criminal that Parker is. And he was so fun to write that I give him his own caper in Crook Manifesto. He gets hired to do security for a blaxploitation film that's being shot in Harlem. And he has some shenanigans. And this one, he gets his own novella as well. I think as the book got bigger and the cast got bigger and more important, I felt that the structure could accommodate giving it the mic over to Pepper for a while. So in the third book, I'm really trying to up the ante and raise the stakes for Pepper. And so he has to wrestle with a word-a-day calendar. The day kicked off with bumptious, which Pepper had never heard before in his whole life. Many of the words seemed like pranks to him, like the word-a-day guy was running a con. Having a superior attitude that expresses itself in an overbearing manner. Sure, he killed or otherwise maimed plenty of bumptious men over the years, on and off the clock. His profession was full of them. Sometimes it helped to be a little too big for your britches to tackle a big score. Bumptious gangsters and hustlers were like cockroaches. For every one you see, there are a dozen more. You'll never get rid of them, but every squash is a victory. The word popped into his head after meeting his employer for the day, Wade Patterson. Wade Patterson is a bumptious individual. A man with a gang of imaginary henchmen circling him, saying, "Yes, boss," and "You're right, boss," at every dipshit thought that popped into his head. Sometimes the stuff in the Mr. Professor word-a-day calendar quickly receded, like the sound of someone else's ambulance, but this word stuck. Dilapidated. Dilapidated also stayed with him because he was dilapidated these days. No two ways around it. In the example sentence, the dilapidated house looks like it's about to fall down. Pepper recognized the word as the mirror that it was. That was him, all right. A heap of creaky floorboards and busted windows. Aches and agonies squatted in him now, unwanted tenants in his extremities and joints. Parts of him alternately tingled, made him groan, went numb. He bounced back from a working over the way he used to. The blows seemed to hammer fall days later. He had to swear off headbutts once the headaches came. Real ice pick stuff that sent him curled on the couch for 2 days. No sound, no lights, until they slumped off. There was a hole in his stomach where the acid ate through, and he had to slug Pepto all day. Creak, creak. It should be understood that over the course of his career, he had conducted a vast inventory of pain. He had gutted, garroted, and grappled with his enemies, and been brutalized, bludgeoned, and manhandled in turn. Shot and stabbed, half strangled, and wholly concussed. Beaten with bats, chains, and a hardware store's worth of ad hoc weapons. Thrown out of cars, thrown out of many types of moving vehicles, tossed into pits, ditches, and ruts, and one time even subjected to a modern update of an ancient Aztec torture ritual. This was in Delaware. Really Baroque stuff by any measure. It was surprising he wasn't more fucked up. The not working made it worse. There was nothing to distract him from his dilapidatedness. Was that a word? Jesus Christ. The world had gotten so busted that he contemplated buying a dictionary. Everybody was driving on rims. So, I guess I didn't know that you write a trilogy, it's like a lot of pages, it's a lot of work. On the one hand, like the structure, it's a good structure, like each novel has 3 acts, 3 years, so act 1, act 2, act 3. If you pull back the 3 books, Harlem Shuffle is act 1, and Crook Manifesto is act 2, and the 3rd book will be act 3. But it gets more complicated as it goes on. So last week I was sort of stuck, and I decided to use ChatGPT. Have you heard of ChatGPT? Everyone's talking about this AI stuff, I guess. So I thought I'd give it a whirl. It didn't work out that great, I have to say. You have to put in a prompt. That's how GPT works, and then it generates a response. I wanted something serious about societal systems, the justice system. There are criminals. There's law-abiding people. The crooked. There's the courts and the cops and corruption. The whole system. So I put that into GPT, and it wasn't that helpful. The thing that came out was not really that helpful. It was not what I was looking for. I'll just read it to you. In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by the equally important groups. The police who investigate crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Chung chung. It sounded a bit familiar. I was like, GPT, isn't that the opening narration of the long-running Dick Wolf police procedural Law and Order? And it started going, does not compute, kill human. Like I asked it to calculate pi to the last digit or something. So the technology is not there, is what I'm saying. Sorry, beware. So before we go to audience questions, if you have questions, I'd like to talk to you, just tell you what I'm working on next. So I'm working on this trilogy, and then I'm always looking forward to what I'm going to do next. So I like to change genres a lot. I have this crime series. I have a zombie novel, a coming-of-age novel, tender coming-of-age novel called Sag Harbor. So the first idea is a real departure for me. I never worked in this genre before. Romance. I think that could be fun. In this case, it's a love story set on the eve of the Russian Revolution. There are a lot of white people in it, so for research I'm watching a lot of Golden Girls movies. Taking notes on Blanche and the girls, and assembling the research is what you do. The other one is a genre that I've already worked in before, sort of obvious, more obvious, science fiction. You know, Zone 1 is sort of science fiction-y. So I think that could be fun to return to that. So science fiction, but specifically science fiction set in the Star Wars universe. You know, for the last couple of years, they've been making all these sequels and TV shows and expanding the canon. And I think there must be room for my vision. I know Disney's really protective of their intellectual property or whatever. But if you ask me, copyright is an outmoded concept. Like being happy or falling in love or something. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions in Star Wars, and I think I could be a real help. Like in the first movie, for example, the Death Star, a weapon the size of a small moon. They have lightsabers, literally swords made out of laser. And they have hyperspace, faster than light drive, that can take you from one end of the universe to the other. But R2-D2 can't get a fucking voice box. Just like, he's the smartest character in all the movies, and they won't hook him up. Luke Skywalker gets his hand cut off. He gets a robot hand. They have technology. Darth Vader falls into a volcano in the prequels. He gets a whole new robot body. The Death Star gets destroyed. And then they make a new Death Star, and this time it's the size of a small planet. But R2-D2 can't get a fucking voice box. Doesn't make sense. C-3PO has a voice box. He's running his mouth the whole time. Like when they land on Tatooine, the desert planet, before they get picked up by the Jawas. Tiny little creatures who are basically sort of space crackheads. They traffic in stolen property and they're all furtive, but in space. Where'd you get this land speeder, Jawa? Like, oh, it fell off a truck. I found it. $5. Do you still have crackheads in Brooklyn Heights, or?
Much fewer.
No, depends what you mean by crackheads. So C-3PO and R2-D2 are wandering the desert, and C-3PO says, I dare say the desert sands are burning my feet. And R2-D2 goes, we know if they had a voice box, you know he's saying, Princess Leia's been kidnapped. I have a blueprint of the Death Star in my chest. Darth Vader's trying to destroy the universe, and this silly motherfucker's trying to have the sand is hot. Plus, we're in love, but we can't get benefits because the Empire won't recognize our union. So, I think the project I do next. And thank you for indulging me. So, do you have any questions or things you'd like to share? Things that are not really questions, but more
Can I
comments?
ask you something? I've been reading some books by S.A. Cosby, and in one of the books, the character drives the getaway car, and he gets a high. I said, wow, I never thought about that. And he goes for that high. And your character, who's killed all these people, he's done this, and he's been beaten up, and everything.
Sure, yeah.
There must be a high in there.
Well, he, you haven't met Pepper before.
No.
So Pepper, he's definitely a strange character. I use the word sociopath, but people tend to judge him harshly. So he's his own. Sorry, the question is about what's the high of doing these crimes.
But there is one. No?
I think not for everybody, or I can't say. I
don't know
just make
either.
up stuff. So.
I don't know. I was surprised to encounter it. I hadn't thought about that.
Yes. I think he enjoys being his own person in a world full of rules and having his own rules. So what's the high of being an outlaw? And for different outlaws, probably different things.
Yeah, sorry. But Pepper comes up with the Crook Manifesto. How do you think Carney lives the Crook Manifesto?
Well, I mean, part of the journey of the book is, so I was thinking about how my wife's like, everyone's saying journey these days, such a cliche, and now I'm starting saying journey all the time. But he's trying to figure it out, and that's probably the fun of it. He's embracing his darker nature, his more criminal nature. He's running away from it. He's embracing it. In the third book, where will he be? Will he give himself totally over to it? Will he integrate it? Will he be still divided soul? And so it's been fun sort of tracking him over the course of 30 years, see how different capers stress him and what they push him to. And so that's basically what I'm figuring out now. Where does he end up after all these after 900 pages? Who is he really?
Hi. Having grown up in New York and researched these books, was there anything you uncovered in the research about the city that even shocked the most skeptical, jaded New Yorker in you?
Not shocked, but delighted. Finding metaphors that I can use, like Seneca Village and Central Park. Someone just mentioned that to me 10 years ago, and I put it down my little. It wasn't in my phone. I didn't write it down. And then, so it was a village of black folks and Irish folks who lived in Central Park, and it was raised. Their community, churches, homes was raised to make Central Park, and it's in like the West 80s. So I put that in there, and I thought about all these different sort of segments of New York that are lost, we're constantly rebuilding. I could use that to talk about the changing city. I could maybe have Elizabeth's family be part of this illustrious black family in Seneca Village. Harlem Shuffle opens up with Radio Row, which was a place for radio and TV hobbyists in the 40s and 50s, and it was raised to make the World Trade Center. And the end of Harlem Shuffle, we go back to that site when they're building the World Trade Center. So find different ways to get into different stuff that's already here in the history of the city that I can use to talk about this flux of this dynamism, how things are constantly changing, how we're constantly changing. I'm tracking Ray Carney's life over 30 years and how he's being constantly transformed. How can I find an analog with that in the city? And that's how the city becomes a character. So nothing's sort of surprising, but when I stumble upon something in my research or just a newspaper article or a sign on the street, that I can use. I'm really delighted. So, hi.
Yes, I wanted to ask, since, with Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys, and you sort of like capture something, about the society, about the times, about history, and I just wondered now that with all these different genres that you're trying out, it's still you writing those stories in those genres, and I was wondering if that sort of gives you access to some ways of telling your story, because you still are going to capture something enormous. So, like, what is it about these different genres that gives you? Does it give you some kind of freedom, or what is it that sort of intrigues you?
Sure, yeah, the question for those at home, could I hear it, is about genre, and I work in these different kinds of modes. What does it do for me? What does it do in terms of the stories, and why is it useful? I just grew up liking different kinds of things. I grew up as like a shut-in, loving comic books and science fiction, and so that was my introduction to storytelling. So it made perfect sense for me to write a zombie novel, because I've been watching zombie movies since I was a kid. And I also like crime stories. I like realistic fiction. And I think the cool thing about my job is that I can write these different modes that I like and salute them, figure out what I want to take from this tradition, what I want to throw out. I spent a lot of time thinking, like, are my zombies fast or slow? That was really fun. Why one, not the other? Came up with my own zombies in that book. And there's no rules. I guess technically the Underground Railroad is a historical novel. But there's a lot of made up stuff. There's a lot of alterations of reality. There's a lot of fantasy in it. I'm not going to get kicked out of the Historical Novelists Union. Like, Louis Mantel's not going to be like, do I got to choke a bitch? She's dead, I'm sorry.
He would have.
Zombies. She would have, yeah. So for me, it's fun. And then you can do something with fantasy that you can't do with realism, and vice versa. And so the Underground Railroad has a fantastic structure. The Nickel Boys is straight realism. It didn't need any kind of adornment to tell the story of these two boys. It's very short and concise. And so that form I picked because of what I wanted to write about. And I couldn't have had the conversation with history that I had in Underground Railroad if I stuck to straight realism. I couldn't juxtapose, say, some of the language of Nazi Germany with the language of race science in 19th century America, and do that in a realistic story. I had to use fantasy. And so all these different things are tools, fantasy, realism, and you pick the right tool for the job. So in addition to just writing different modes being a fun thing to do, because I like these different kinds of stories, there's something you can do with realism that you can't do with fantasy, and vice versa.
I'm also a huge fan of the Parker novels. I'm very excited to learn Pepper was named in homage. Were there other heist books that you read for this series that sort of stuck with you?
Yeah, I mean, like I started before I even conceived of it, really before I had a big plan. I was reading detective novels, like, actually, that's not really helpful. I want to write about psychos and criminals. So, but the three influences would be Richard Stark, Patricia Highsmith. I mean, I think what Ripley in the Ripley novels will accept to himself, his divide itself is really interesting. He knows he does all this stuff, but he never can really articulate on the page. And we know because we see him killing people, but we sort of clued into how divided he is. And so that kind of psychological play was useful to go to Patricia Highsmith. And then Chester Himes, just for permission to be, the book is really realistic, and his Harlem is really sort of phantasmagorical, like it's hard to pin down. And I think reading him, he was writing in the 50s and 60s, gave me permission to have my own, not worry so much about getting it right. I can push it a little bit because he sort of gave me permission. So those three people, and then really, but just my introduction to the heist genre is really movies and watching Channel 5 and Channel 9 like in the 80s and 70s and seeing these great matinees on weekends. There's a question back there.
Oh yeah, it was me. If these heist movies and shows like inspired you to start writing these books, did you envision these books as movies while you were writing?
Not movies or TV shows when I'm writing it. I think they're too big for like a movie. I did start writing and working with a producer like last spring on adapting Harlem Shuffle, and it was really fun, something I hadn't done before. I was like, and then they're gonna play this song. I was like, spent all day coming up with songs to play. That was the end credits. That was like the fun part for me. And then the strike came and put everything to a halt, and so I'll finish the third book and then take it out, and so it's a very different thing. You know, just because you can write novels doesn't mean you can write TV. Just because you write poetry doesn't mean you can write something else, and so it's a different skill. Usually I write a screenplay. I've written a few, and people are always like, "Oh, you're such a good novelist." So we'll see if I just give it to somebody else and they do it, or I have to learn a new skill or something. So 2 more questions, if there are 2 more questions. Or... Yeah.
So there's a lot of getting over in Crooklyn. What does getting over mean? In the
Well, as I'm going toward the end, it means like your jackpot. What's your big score that allows you to cash out? And so in Crook Manifesto, Munson, the crooked cop, he's like burning his bridges, and now commission's coming down. He's cashing out, so he's going for a jackpot. So that's one thing. A heist story can go 2 ways. You can plot and plan and be like really handsome and stuff like that, like the Ocean's 11 guys, and pull it off, have this great technology, and everything comes together. Or in the heist movies, I really like the wheelman is on drugs, the safecracker, his wife is cheating on him, he's upset. You plot and plan, and you try to transcend your fate. If you just pull off this heist, you can transcend your fate. And then of course you can't, you never can. And so the heist can go either way. That's what I love about the genre. So getting over, for me, is you had this sort of grubby, terrible life, but if you pull off this big score, you can reverse all of that. And of course, you know, I think in the best heist stories you don't, because you can't do that.
But it seems like there's Lucinda's getting over, like, are other people
And then,
getting over?
and then more people pull off their schemes in this book. I think coming after Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys, where I had characters who were very much contained by institutional racism and their fates. I want to have a character who wins sometimes. So Carney does win.
Yeah.
Doesn't really win all the time, but definitely he does get over. And that's sort of, it's fun to have a character who can do that.
I agree, totally.
So. Hi.
I thought that Harlem Shuffle was in many ways a love story between Carney and Elizabeth, and then in Crook's Manifesto, it kind of hit a little rough patch, kind of. And I just wondered, what are you doing with Elizabeth in the 3rd book?
Right, well, you know, it's 30 years in a person's life. And so the kids are 1 and 2 in the 1st book, and then they're in high school in the 2nd book, and in the 3rd book. It's getting more autobiographical because, like, empty nester. So it's like an empty nester, and has to more than that. And then, of course, 30 years is a long time in Elizabeth's life. And so she has a job in the 1st book. She's, I don't want to ruin it, but.
So don't.
So she's evolving too, and she's a really great character. It's nice to have a sort of a loving relationship, a romantic relationship in the book. But over 30 years, you're going to have, you know, your ups and downs, and so I'm plotting the same way I'm plotting Carney and Pepper. I'm plotting Elizabeth's, you know, next stage of her journey. There's a feminist movement, civil rights movement. How does that change the circumstances for a woman in the workplace, perhaps a female entrepreneur? So I'm tracking her as well, and she's gonna have as bad a case of empty nest syndrome as Carney does, but you know, she's made of sterner stuff. So thanks so much for coming out.
thank you all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you to everyone who asked questions. Thank you, Colson, for spending this evening with us. Just a few reminders before we wrap up. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a copy of Crook Manifesto and the rest of his books by clicking the link in the live stream description. For those of you with us tonight, we have plenty of additional copies available for purchase at the register where you checked in, along with several of his backlist titles. Colson will be around to sign and personalize your books. Sonia, would you mind pointing to the receiving desk? That's going to be happening right over there. So we're going to ask that you all line up down the center aisle, curve around to the door. Please make sure you grab all of your personal belongings with you. Thank you all again for coming out. Let's give them one last round of applause.